listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, a 4-day working week is back on the national agenda as the federal government looks to fix our nation's productivity crisis. So will it happen and who will be the winners and losers? We unpack all the details about the latest push to shake up the workplace. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Tuesday, the 22nd of July. Parliament has officially returned for the first time since May's federal election. The Labor government has a majority, with pressure increasing for it to follow through on key election promises, including fixing the nation's housing crisis, bringing down power bills and also ensuring more GPs can bulk bill. Here is the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Every day is an opportunity to deliver for Australians, and this week we will have legislation to do that.
4 teenagers, including 3 13-year-old girls, will face court at a later date after being arrested for allegedly stealing a car which flipped and then crashed in a suburban street in a Melbourne suburb. The black Subaru also reportedly smashed into a number of cars along the street before crashing. The teenagers then allegedly fled the vehicle before being apprehended. And a relative of Princes William and Harry has been found dead in her family home. 20-year-old Rosie Roche, who is a distant cousin, was found dead in Norton in the UK by her mother and sister, with the coroner confirming the death was not suspicious. Rosie was the granddaughter of Princess Diana's uncle. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the 4-day working week with the future of work expert Dr Libby Sander. New research shows a shorter working week with the same pay not only boosts performance but also reduces burnout and improves our physical and mental health. So what's holding so many companies and bosses back from rolling it out? And will it work for everyone? Libby, thanks so much for joining us. As we know, productivity, the topic of productivity is front and centre at the moment, with the Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, saying we need to fix our productivity levels in this country, which have actually fallen to a 60-year low. What is productivity and how do we measure it in 2025?
Yeah, great question, Tash. So I'm not an economist, so I won't sort of do the metrics that they do. But if we look at the workplace and modern knowledge work, this is one of the core issues that we've currently got, because you can be in the office all day, the FaceTime, running around with a sheaf of papers in your arms like the Office TV show, and everyone's saying, isn't that person busy? They're so productive, right? Sitting in meetings all day. But does that really equate to productivity? We're not in Henry Ford's workplace anymore, where we could follow you around with a stopwatch and measure how many widgets you were putting on the car. So it's probably the wrong metric now. And many economists have actually indicated that just measuring time and motion is no longer going to be what we need in terms of knowledge work. We're not robots. The outcomes we need to produce nowadays are very much tied into creativity and innovation. We can't just sit at one desk for 8 hours and produce the same standard of work. And so we should be looking at things like outcomes rather than what are you doing all day. And I'm sure we've all worked with people who are very busy, but maybe not very productive.
So in regards to tackling this, Libby, as we all know, it depends on the employee or the employer. There are great attitudes in a lot of workspaces today where they understand the importance of work-life balance and if you have the right outcomes. So how do we start to refocus some workplaces that I know some experts have almost criticised as dinosaur attitudes about you need to be in the office for 12 hours a day when they're not actually hitting those outcomes?
I think the really good way to approach this, Tash, is just what's the data say? And if we look at the data, including plenty of this from economists, you can't just keep being productive like a robot, work longer hours and your productivity keeps going up. Not only does it flatten out, it goes off a cliff pretty rapidly and goes in the other direction, and you start being extremely unproductive, inefficient, making all kinds of mistakes. And so this idea of long work hours work longer, you're going to produce more things is actually not true when we're looking at human beings in the type of modern office work that a lot of people now do. And so we do need to shift the thinking around what's the outcome we need to produce and what's the best way to actually go about doing that. And that's going to vary by industry. It's going to vary by the individual, the nature of that task. And the best organizations in the world are doing that. They're saying, okay, here's what you need to do. What is the most effective way to do that? Knowing that a lot of this work actually requires different processes than we had, 50 years ago.
So in regards to the 4-day working week, because that's kind of been flagged as a possibility from this roundtable that's being headed by our federal treasurer. But the interesting thing with some unions pushing for this 4-day working week is the fact that in their research that they're showing that it increases productivity, it decreases the chance of burnout if you have a 4-day working week, but you don't cut wages. Is that going to be realistic for all workplaces?
The great thing about this new study that's just come out about the 4-day work week is that it really supports a range of work that's been done, research around the world over the last 2 years. There have been pilot trials done in numerous organizations, numerous countries, all finding similar results. In fact, that people can be more productive, that revenue increases in the organizations that participated, that sales increases in the organizations that participated. And I think really tellingly, over 95 or 96% of organizations that were in those trials elected to keep the 4-day work week after the trial had ended. So aside from the tremendous health and wellbeing benefits, recruitment benefits, the ability to attract staff, which we can talk about, the pure economic benefits were there. So I think we've got the data now to say that it doesn't mean you're giving up revenue. In fact, you might be making more revenue.
So how does this play out for different workplaces? And you mentioned this before, Libby, because, if you go and say to great frontline workers, for example, nurses, emergency workers, ambulance officers, a 4-day working week may not be viable in some of those industries. And from productivity and outcomes, they're some of the best achievers because they do work 24/7 and literally every day they're saving lives.
Look, some of the workplaces that we are talking about here do have flexible work arrangements and have had for some time, if we're looking at certainly employees in some government sectors, in health. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a 4-day work week. It can be flexible hours. It can be what's called a compressed work week, which is, sounds technical, but, sort of a variation on this. And in fact, Mars Wrigley in Australia has a 4-day work week. So that's a food manufacturing where you think, well, they can't do it, can they? They've got to be in the factory every day making the things that Mars Wrigley makes. Construction firms have done this, again, on-site, labour intensive. So it is possible to provide this variation and this flexibility that we know workers value tremendously. And if we look at rates of burnout, of stress, of mental health claims in organisations, it's billions of dollars a year, which is an enormous burden on organisations and on the economy. It's not sustainable. It's a huge board level issue in insurance companies at the moment that they're not going to be able to afford to pay these claims out in the future. So we need to start thinking differently. We know, particularly as you mentioned, health staff, they're tremendously overworked. It could be a resourcing issue, but it requires a few different avenues to address this.
So the data is there, and let's just quickly talk about this latest research paper. It was 2,896 employees across 141 organisations in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, Ireland and the UK took part in this 6-month trial. Unpack some of the key takeaways for us in this, Libby.
So what was really interesting is, as we said, it supports previous research that's been done in this area. So, significant reductions, I think 71% in reported feelings of burnout, 40-something% in terms of stress in the workplace, people sleeping better, feeling more effective in their job, more engaged. And, other outcomes we see in this research in this area are reduced sick leave, reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover, which are enormous cost to organisations. So even though this is a self-report study, they did a control group of another group of organisations where they didn't make this intervention and didn't see the same results. So, these are really significant findings.
So, Libby, the question to you, if the data is there, if it produces great outcomes, if it doesn't affect revenue and profits for some companies, why haven't we got a 4-day working week?
Yeah, that's a $64 million question, Tash. And I think a great example of why we don't have this is exactly the same that we might have discussed about working from home before the pandemic. So for decades, we had the ability to work from home, we had the technology, we certainly had the desire, but we had a mindset that it's not possible, people won't perform, productivity will crash, they'll be at home watching Netflix. And then we conclusively showed that, in fact, it is possible, and productivity, in fact, went up in many cases. So it's really our mindset around this. And I think Maynard Keynes said in the 60s, didn't he, we'd be working only 15 hours a week by 2030 because of technology. And unfortunately, it seems to be going in the other direction at the moment. So it really is purely a mindset factor. But the great thing is the more of these studies that we have, the more companies participating in trials, continuing to keep the arrangement after the trial's over, it provides, I guess, that pathway for other organisations to say, okay, we can do this. And I think ultimately it will become a competitive advantage. So the companies that don't do it are going to lose the best talent to the companies that do offer this.
So in regards to this economic roundtable, Libby, to start this, does the federal government have to legislate this, or is it a voluntary setup? Explain how this would work if this did actually come to fruition.
I think we may be quite a long way from legislation because there are a range of things that need to be done to implement this. And so in this particular study, we saw that you need to do interventions beforehand, whether that be around what are the inefficiencies, what are the things that we're doing. We don't want to just cram 5 days into 4 days. So I think that the way forward is to show here's how it can be done. Here's the way that it could happen in your industry rather than mandating it at the moment. The model that's been used for the trials is what we call 100-180, which is you're expected to produce 100% of your normal outcomes for your job. You get 100% of the pay, but you only have to work 80% of the hours. There are other models, obviously, where you can take less pay, but this is the one that all the research is being done on. And certainly with the cost of living, people are unlikely to want to give up that pay. So I think it's about modelling at this stage, education on both sides for organisations and for individuals into how we could make this work.
Do you think we will see more companies jump on board and take the lead in making this commonplace very, very shortly?
I really think we will. And the drivers of that, Tash, are really the declining population in terms of birth rates, the ageing population, declining rates of labour force participation. We've seen just in the last 2 weeks a study that showed Gen Z don't want to be managers. They think it's too stressful. They're not really interested. They want part-time work or portfolio careers. So we're approaching a labour cliff. And yes, AI is going to augment or in some cases replace roles, but it's not going to fill the gap that we've got. And so the organisations that offer this are going to have the competitive advantage to get the talent that they need. And frankly, the organisations that don't are going to be facing some really tough situations. I talk to employers all the time. I have recruitment agents in accounting say to me, I can't even get junior accountants to go to interviews. They just don't want to be accountants. So I think this is the sleeping issue that we're really not looking at in organisations, is that this labour shortage is coming. We're never going back to the days when you had thousands of candidates applying for one job. You know, occasionally in some industries that might be the case, but we've got a human population decline in most Western nations, and so that's the issue.
Very interesting to see how this plays out. We really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much, Libby.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tash.
That was Future of Work expert Dr Libby Sander. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.